Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Nichols. I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm still letting a few people in to our program. I would just ask everyone if you could ensure that your camera is turned off and that you're on mute for the program as we have this discussion. Thank you all. And tonight, it's our pleasure to host Dr. Justene Hill Edwards from the University of Virginia, talking about really this fascinating book on the Freedman's Bank called Savings and Trust. One of those stories, I think, like many of you, that I knew about a bit, but certainly not the full story. And we'll hear about that tonight, and hopefully you will be reading it very soon if you haven't already. Before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors for tonight, Abel and Sons Roofing and Siding and Visit Hershey Harrisburg. They're both very generous to us and have been supporting these programs since the beginning, so thank you to them. Our next civil conversation in this online series will be on Thursday, February 20th, a book called Freedom Soldiers, The Emancipation of Black Soldiers in Civil War Camps, Courts, and Prisons, by Dr. Jonathan Land, I believe it's pronounced, and he is from Purdue, I believe. Another interesting topic. There's probably going to be another one in between tonight's and that one. I haven't confirmed it in time for this meeting, but hopefully we'll be able to have that as well. And speaking of this great book, you can purchase this book by going to our website. I put some information in the chat feature of how to do that. You go to our website at nationalcivilwarmuseum.org, go to our shop, go to the book section, you'll see this book there. And Justine was kind enough to sign them for us. So we have autographed copies right there that you can purchase, and you get this really nice new bookmark to go with it with old Abe on there. If you choose to do that tonight, you can also get a discount when you purchase the book and go to the checkout. You will there's a place for a code to put in, and just put in the word trust, TRUST, and that'll get you a 10% discount to purchase the book. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Justene. Justene Hill Edwards is Associate Professor of History in the Cochran Department of History at the University of Virginia. Her research explores the intersection of African American history, the history of slavery, and the history of American capitalism. In her work, she investigates slavery's role in the long history of economic inequality in America, focusing on the 18th and 19th centuries. Always highlighting the lives of enslaved and formerly enslaved people of African descent in the United States. She is the author of Unfree Markets, The Slaves, Economy, and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina, published in 2021. And the book she's here tonight to talk about this course is Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedman's Bank. Welcome, Justine.
Thank you for having me. I should know how to use Zoom by now.
We all should, but you know how it is. And again, thank you all for joining us. Again, if you have any questions as we go through, just use the chat feature and I'll either feed them in as we go along or get to some of those at the end. So Justine, to kind of begin at the beginning, what led you to this topic of the Freedman's Bank?
Sure. Well, a couple things. First, as I was finishing my first book on free markets, really turning it from a dissertation into a book manuscript, I was thinking, of course, about next projects, especially as I started my job at the University of Virginia teaching African American history. And at the time, I lived in Washington, D.C., and this was the same time that the Department of Treasury put a plaque recognizing the history of the Freedman's Bank on the Treasury Annex. If you go there, you can see it today. It's adjacent to the White House and the Department of Treasury. And so I lived in D.C., and my husband would subsequently walk around there. And he asked me one day about the history of the Freedmen's Bank. And I kind of knew about it in terms of my history of the war and of Reconstruction. And I knew that it was established in 1865 and it failed in 1874. And that was about it. But I quickly realized that it was a fascinating topic. It was a topic that while historians, especially of the 19th century, knew about, there wasn't much scholarship about it. There were two books. The last book on the Freedmen's Bank, the last scholarly book, was actually published in 1976.
Huh.
The book before that was published in 1927. And
Wow.
so there are a handful of book chapters, really great book chapters, a handful of journal articles. But I felt as though this was a good time to do a renewed deep dive into the history of the bank, and in particular connect the bank's history to really important conversations that we continue to have today about economic inequality and the racial wealth gap.
Yep, and we'll get to some of that a little later on in the conversation. And it's interesting to hear from a historian that you were aware of the bank. I mentioned the same thing at the beginning before we logged on, that I was aware of it but didn't know the details. So this is really great. And so it wasn't, though, and this is obviously something that comes out at the tail end of the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bank. We'll talk about the founding of it and the role the government played in it. But there was also banks that popped up during the course of the war, it seems, and it had to do with U.S. colored troops and their officers. Can you tell us some of the background on that and how some of the banks sort of came into existence?
Sure. So the idea of the Freedmen's Bank really came from the success of the military savings banks established in 1864. And so there were three, one in Norfolk, Beaufort, and New Orleans. And these banks were established and created specifically for Black soldiers, especially those soldiers who were just first kind of making money for their military service. And so one of the biggest challenges that these Black soldiers faced was how to save their money. They would get paid by a paymaster, and they had nowhere to put their money. And most importantly, what they wanted to do was send their money back to their family to help them buy food, buy shelter, perhaps. And so these military savings banks were essentially a test case to see if African Americans would willingly bank, and if they would be excited about participating in this very exciting new age of finance that began to emerge during the Civil War.
So, and in many cases, the gentlemen, the men putting money into the things, the first time they had really money to do that with. They had, some of them escaped slaves. Maybe they had some before in slavery. That did happen, obviously, but not a lot. So it was sort of new for everyone. And there's another thing you mentioned as a prelude to the bank, and that's Special Order Number 15, Sherman Special Order Number 15, because I think they're tied together, at least in the spirit of things. Can you talk briefly about that, and then we'll get into the bank itself?
Sure. Well, Special Field Order Number 15 was transformational, and it had the potential to be even more transformational. The fact that about 400,000 acres of prime coastal land real estate taken from Confederates during the war would be given to the recently emancipated was extraordinary. And for African Americans, what it did was it gave them kind of a bit of hope. The idea that for generations they and their families had been toiling, had been living on this land, had enriched the nation and had enriched enslavers, but could acquire kind of prime real estate to help them begin their new lives in this period of freedom was extraordinary, and it was again transformational. And so, coupled with the idea of a savings bank, first and foremost for the recently emancipated, the kind of twin goals of land and of banking was supposed to help African Americans, again, in this new period of freedom, to help them start their lives as emancipated peoples.
Yeah, and that's clear. It comes through the book that this combination of personal wealth over time, and land was a key selling point for all of this, and a key goal, I think, for a lot of the recently freed peoples. So there's these movements during the war, and as the war is concluding is really when the Freedmen's Bank begins to take hold. And
Yeah.
there's one person in particular that I wanted you to talk about at this point, and that is John Alvord, I believe it's
Yes.
pronounced. Could
Yes.
you talk a little bit about John Alvord, who he was, and what was his role in
Mhm.
all of in the forming of the Freedmen's Bank?
Yeah, John Alvord is a central character in this story. He was an abolitionist. He was a minister. He was born in Connecticut, but yeah, he was a graduate of Yale College. And during the war, his family lived in New Jersey. So at this time, he was working as an attaché with the Union Army, and he, in 1864, was traveling around the South, and in particular in the summer and fall of that year, he was following William Sherman in his famed march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. And he used this opportunity to speak to as many African Americans as possible. He wanted to know what their lives were like in slavery. He wanted to know how they survived the war. But he wanted to know their kind of hopes and dreams and goals for this new but really unstable period of freedom. And so, first and foremost, they were telling him that they wanted to reunite with their families. They wanted to be with their families. They also wanted, importantly, access to land. And they didn't just want to be given land, they wanted the opportunity to save money to buy land, which I think is really important. And so Alvord is kind of absorbing all of this information. It's a really thrilling experience. I came across this amazing cache of letters where he writes to his wife and says that like he wants to come home, but he's kind of exploring this new side of kind of being an American that he had never experienced, being front and center with African Americans, especially formerly enslaved people. And so in January of 1865, he travels to New York, and he comes up with the idea of the Freedman Savings and Trust Company. He gathers a group of white abolitionists, bankers, ministers, politicians, really a who's who of men in politics and finance at this time. And he encourages them to support a plan to create the Freedmen's Bank. And so he, a colleague of his from the American Missionary Association, traveled to DC, and they essentially lobby members of Congress and federal authorities to support a bill to create the Freedmen's Bank, which happens on March 3rd of 1865. And so he is an early advocate of savings banking for African Americans. He wants to kind of spread the gospel of banking and of freedom and of political participation. But interestingly enough, he's not a banker. He doesn't really know much about finance. At this time, he and his family are actually struggling financially, such that he attempts to kind of say yes to various jobs and positions in the Lincoln administration to support himself and his family. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit that I trace throughout the book is his enthusiasm, but his relative naivete about banking and finance.
Yes, and that will come to the forefront as time marches on. Unfortunately, and you mentioned in March of 1865, Lincoln signs this bill.
Yes.
It's a sort of part of along with the establishing what became the Freedmen's Bureau as well. Similar time, or maybe the same night, he signed these
Yep.
different bills, but the same idea. And I think an important part to stress is that this bank, I don't think altruistic is the right term, but it was almost philanthropic, at least the intent, at least his intent, even Congress's intent. I think it started with really good intentions and the idea of it being a savings and trust and not a lending bank. Can you talk about that distinction and how important that was? And then we'll get to what happened.
Sure. So the Freedmen's Bank was established as a benevolent institution. It was created out of this kind of this set of priorities that began in the early 19th century around kind of alleviating poverty in cities, such that the first of these types of savings banks was established in Philadelphia in 1816. And it was created by philanthropists to help the poor and working classes kind of save. And so there was this idea that kind of inspiring ideas of what they call thrift was really important to helping alleviate poverty, especially in cities. And so the Freedmen's Bank was kind of inspired out of this kind of savings bank revolution. But it was created to be as low risk as possible. It was supposed to be, again, a simple savings bank. Depositors would deposit money, and if they left their money in for 6 months to a year, then they would earn about 4 to 6% interest on their deposits, which at this time was high, but it was kind of meant to encourage African Americans to leave their money in the bank for longer periods of time. And so it was supposed to the bank's board of trustees was supposed to invest the bank's deposits, a third of the deposits, in government securities and bonds. And so again, this was seen as being one of the most low risk investments. And so the bank fundamentally was supposed to operate, again, with the least amount of risk possible to protect the investments and the deposits of African Americans at this time, most of whom were formerly enslaved.
And that was part of it too. And it was set up to receive the deposits of former slaves. That was part of the charter, I believe. And this idea, again, of money and property, being able to do that. And this push also to save the small sums. That was a big push at the beginning, at least, of this, that whatever you had, put it into the bank and save it for a rainy day, or let it grow a little bit and then take it out. So that was all part of it. And so the bank is formed. It has an independent board of trustees who sort of manage it. It's based in New York at this point.
At the beginning.
And they begin also to open branches. Can you talk a little bit about how the bank started and well, I guess how the bank grew over that first year and a half,
Sure.
and how it expanded and what the reaction was from the African American community? Sure.
Well, the bank's kind of seed funding came from those 3 military savings banks. And so because of the success of those banks, the bank started to create branches. And so it's important to note, too, that this was really one of the first banks to operate in a way that we would recognize today, with a main office in one city and then branches across states. Most banks at this time, other than, of course, the first and second bank of the U.S. in the early 19th century, operated this way. But the Freedmen's Bank was really the first bank to have branches. And so the bank's board of trustees attempted to create branches in cities with large African American populations. And so we're talking about, again, Norfolk, Beaufort, Charleston, Richmond, New Orleans, Savannah, Atlanta. And so again, we're talking about these cities in the South, in addition to creating branches in New York, DC, and Philadelphia. But in the first few months, the bank's white administrators actually kind of had a hard time encouraging African Americans to open accounts. And I have this great vignette, I believe it's in chapter 2, where we see the bank's kind of core administrators travel to Richmond. And this is in the few months after the fall of the Confederacy, and they go to a Black bank and they speak to a Black congregation in the city. They are expecting the Black congregants to really not know anything about banking and finance, but they are asked really great questions about how the bank was going to operate. Were there going to be Confederates on the board of trustees? How would the bank's money be invested? That was a question too, which I think is just fascinating. Yeah. And this idea that, yes, African Americans may not have had sophisticated ideas of finance, but I say this in the book, book, they did understand money. They understood the importance of money. They understood saving. They understood wanting to put money away for big purchases. And even though, again, they may not have had sophisticated understandings of how finance worked, they did understand money. And so it is interesting to kind of pair their ideas about how they would use the bank with how white administrators hoped that African Americans would use the bank. African Americans wanted to use the bank, as we might say, as like a checking account to put money in and then withdraw once they had enough money to buy what they wanted, which most times was land or property. The white bank administrators hoped and expected and anticipated that African Americans would use the bank more like a savings account, perhaps like a CD in modern terms, to leave money in the bank for long periods of time so that they could invest the deposits so that the deposits could grow. And so I talk about this. There was really a misalignment early on between what the depositors wanted and what the white bank administrators expected in terms of their economic behavior.
And you mentioned that it's the Black Depositors and White Administration, and it did start off as essentially an organization run by whites, yes. Even at the teller level at the beginning. But slowly, over the first year or two, that began to change a little bit. Can you tell us the story of William J. Wilson?
Yes.
The first African Americans to be employed by the bank.
Yes. And so William J. Wilson, he worked, I believe, for the Department of Treasury as a courier. And he's known within the Black community in Washington, D.C. as being a hard worker, an earnest guy. And so African Americans lobby members of the Board of Trustees to have him as the bank's cashier. And so he becomes the first Black cashier of the Freedman's Bank, working in the Washington, D.C. branch. And and it is interesting because he kind of becomes a figurehead for the Black depositors in the city. And he kind of stands out as, again, being a representative for African Americans who are patronizing the bank.
And he'll be the first employee, he won't be the last, and then eventually there'll be some trustees as well, and one in particular we'll get to at the end of the story, or president of the bank, we should say. But you also mentioned
shadowing a lot.
Yeah. There are a couple of Douglases too, which kind of threw me off for a minute, but yes. I caught on. You also mentioned that one of the branches was in Lynchburg, Virginia. I lived in Lynchburg for 7 years. I worked in that part of the world. And that was one of the larger cities in the South that wasn't really impacted significantly physically by the war. And so I think that's one reason it ended there. But that was also one of the first they closed a little bit later on. But back to the story. You get to 1867, and I think you're right that that's a real pivotal year.
Yeah.
And I think we didn't really say this at the beginning, but the bank's lifespan is only about 9 years in total. Its legacy goes on and its issues go on. So we're in year 2 or 3 here, and things begin to change. The bank set up with good intentions, and African Americans were certainly using it. It was increasing money coming in, but as you said, they're using it more like we would use an account today: money in, money out, for what you need. And that wasn't able to float the operations as they were expanding of the bank itself. And they also began to bring in other people, and this is where Alvord nominates and eventually gets appointed a trustee named Henry D. Cook.
Yes.
And this is where things really do get cooking, as it were, with the bank and the issues with the bank. Can you tell us who he was and what his role was? And there's 2 people in particular, William Huntington and Daniel L. Eaton, that he brings on. Can you kind of weave that story together for us and kind of lay the groundwork for the next few years?
Sure. So 1867 was a pivotal year for the bank. Alvord starts to have conversations about moving the bank's main office from New York, one of the kind of financial hubs, to Washington. a nation's political hub, of course. And so while he's doing this, while he's trying to convince other trustees to accept this, that it would make sense for the bank to move closer to the White House, to Congress, to Treasury for a whole host of reasons, he brings on 3 trustees that I contend dramatically shift the fundamental mission of the bank. And that's Henry Cook, William Huntington, and D.L. Eaton. And so Cook is the brother of famed investment banker Jay Cook. And Jay Cook founded Jay Cook and Company, the nation's first investment bank. Jay and Henry Cook were very close with Lincoln, with Salmon P. Chase, who was transitioning from being Treasury Secretary to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they are incredibly well connected. And so when Henry Cook, who is the president of the First National Bank of DC, which was the DC branch of Jay Cook and Company, he comes on to the board of trustees. He brings Huntington, he brings D.L. Eaton, who ends up being the bank's actuary. And when the 3 of them joined the board in the spring of 1867, they kind of shift, again, the bank's mission. They also shift the strategies that they use to invest the bank's deposits. And so, in particular, what happens in this time is that the bank makes its first illegal loan in April of 1867, and they make it to the bank's new actuary. And so D.L. Eaton, he takes about $1,000 from the bank. It's a loan. He eventually pays it back. But with that loan and with this move, I contend that the bank's, again, fundamental mission shifts, and it kind of opens the floodgates. First, it's a trickle in terms of loans going out, but eventually these 3 men, with John Alvord's support, he becomes the bank's president the next year in 1868. They decide to lobby members of Congress to amend the bank's charter. And so again, the bank is a fundamentally simple savings bank. It was not supposed to make loans. But the reality was that the bank's expenses were exceeding the bank's kind of small amount of profits, especially with the rapidity that the bank was opening branches across the South. And so at its height, the bank had 37 branches across 17 states. And so we are talking about a bank with a high overhead, essentially. And so the bank lobbies members of Congress. There is some pushback as to whether the bank should be able to make loans, but essentially the amendment goes through. And so in May of 1870, the bank officially can start to make loans within bounds. The loans were supposed to be securitized with 2 times the value of the loan. It was supposed to be evidence of real estate collateral, and this quickly kind of goes out the window. The bank's finance committee, controlled by Henry Cook, starts to just kind of make hundreds of thousands, soon to be millions of dollars of loans without proper collateral. And so this is when the bank really starts to collapse, because eventually African Americans cannot withdraw money on demand, because so much money is being lent to the business partners and friends of the bank's white trustees.
Yeah, and that's sort of the where this story takes that tragic turn, because in the end there's one group of victims, and those were the African Americans who put their money into this. But taking a step back to this change, one thing you might say in the 21st century is, well, what about regulators? Was there anyone watching any of this on the federal level or state level? And as we know, and we see in this, it wasn't a lot going on. Can you talk a little bit about that? And obviously, when you have the actuary being the first person who actually gets a legal loan, it can't be too tight. So can you talk about what that was like at the time, regulation of the banking industry in general?
Well, we are talking about a period of time when the nation has its first financial regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And the comptroller was made responsible from the National Banking Act of 1863 and 64 for regulating the nation's banks. And this is, again, a period of time when the American banking industry is undergoing a dramatic restructuring. We're talking about the creation of a national currency. Again, we're talking about the nation's first regulator, and we're talking about a nation emerging out of the struggles of war. And those struggles were military in addition to being economic. Somebody had to pay for the war. And so the nation was in debt. And so part of this story is that instead of regulating officially the Freedmen's Bank, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was not officially the bank's regulator. It was Congress. And so because Congress was made responsible in the Freedmen's Bank Act for regulating the bank, they just didn't do it, which I mean, it's kind of simple to say, but they didn't. There was no examination of the books, no making sure that the bank's trustees and administrators were comporting with the original charter. Once the amendment went into effect, there was no kind of examination. Actually, the first examination happened in 1873.
And by then it was far too late. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, it is worth saying that Reconstruction is an incredibly violent time. It was a very kind of unstable, it was characterized by instability, of violence, of African Americans attempting to gain political rights while kind of white terrorism, especially in the South, was rampant. And so the regulation of the Freedmen's Bank was not front and center. And again, we are talking about members of the kind of political and economic elite who had business and personal relationship with members of Congress. And so they were disincentivized to kind of meddle in the bank's business at this time.
So, as I shared with you when we were preparing for this call, that I had a professor back in 2008 when I was in graduate school talking about the crisis that was going at that time, and what better opportunity than to ask a professor as you're sitting there, a business, what's happening? And he didn't have too many answers except for one good one. And he turned to the wall on the blackboard and he wrote one word, and it was greed.
Yeah.
And so greed plays a huge part of this. Especially with those three men, Henry Cook and Huntington and Eaton. But, you know, at this transition from New York to D.C., they relocated the organization, and they also purchased land and decided to build a new, rather nice building. And it's sort of that old story where you overbuild and can't handle it. Can you talk a bit about that process? And what effect that had on the bank?
Sure. Well, the bank's trustees, when they moved to Washington, decided that they wanted to purchase a building. They wanted it to be front and center so that whenever anyone walked past Treasury or the White House or walked on their way to Congress, they would walk past the main branch of the Freedman Savings and Trust Company. And so thus began kind of a 2-year project of building a branch, getting architects, getting construction done to create this beautiful building. Interestingly, it was Frederick Douglass who wrote that when he first went into the main branch, he was stunned by its sheer opulence. It was framed with walnut and marble, and it was one of the most stunning buildings in the city, which I think was saying a lot. And the building at the time cost $260,000 to build. And it made it one of the most expensive buildings in the city at this time. The money was not supposed to come from deposits. It subsequently did. But the bank was kind of a representation of the bank's kind of rotten core. that the money for this beautiful building came from the hard work of the recently emancipated, but most of them never got to see its beauty. So, yeah. And so
you make a point of talking about how nice the boardroom was, where they would meet and wine and dine whoever they needed to secure additional loans and various other activities. So all of this sort of comes together, and the building, of course, wasn't supposed to cost $200,000+, but like most building projects, it starts at a budget and ends somewhere else, and it's never a smaller amount. So all of these things are happening. As you mentioned, it's not happening in a vacuum either, politically either. Reconstruction is underway. Grant is president by this point. The Ku Klux Klan is very active before and slightly during this, and other issues that are popping up, and slowly Democrats are also beginning to kind of feed in to Congress again, and you're beginning to see that erosion of Reconstruction in general. And so all of these things are sort of playing together as you move through this time period. And you mentioned the congressional debates that happened about revising the charter in 1870, and I bring that up because it was interesting to see the senators, I think in this case, who they were and which sides they were on. Charles Sumner, who was one of the abolitionists and of course famously beaten on the House floor, he is an advocate for this change, and someone a lot of us in Harrisburg are aware of, Simon Cameron, also a senator at the time, was opposed to it. And he was opposed to it because he thought that, quote, "I think it will in the end probably destroy the institution." Boy, was he right. He wasn't the most honest guy either. So it's interesting coming from him that he saw this. I know you talked about it briefly. Can you talk a little bit about the debate and how it ended?
Sure. Well, these congressional debates are kind of a fascinating treasure trove, and they kind of came out not as I expected. You have Republicans, especially radical Republicans, really supporting the bank. I think Henry Cook, being a Republican, was really good at convincing members of his party to support the bank's amendment, because he was making this claim in terms of, well, if we are more audacious with our investments, then what that will mean is that African Americans will be able to earn more money. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to do with this bank, with this financial institution. But there were members of Congress, increasingly Democrats, who were really pushing back, saying, well, I'm not quite sure if this is the kind of road that you want to take, or we should not trust that you have the best interests of African Americans at heart, which is so fascinating to hear. But these political debates are, again, inherently partisan. And that kind of tracks through the bank's history in that there are Democrats who are really pushing back on the creation of the bank, for the expansion of the bank's charter. And we see that again play out in these really interesting congressional conversations about the bank's future.
What else is new? And there's a question from the audience about where was the building located? Okay. Going back to the location of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if anyone has been, and I say this at the beginning of the book, if you have been to Washington, D.C., to the National Mall, and you stand in front of the White House facing north to 16th Street, and if the White House is behind you, and if the Treasury is on your right, then the Freedman's Bank was right in front of that. And so it was essentially within the White House complex. It was, again, front and center. When you walk through, I think it's Lafayette Square, it is kind of, it was right there, right in front of the Department of Treasury.
Great, thank you. And we haven't really talked about too much, at least, about some of the people who actually put their money into this bank. And one story you bring up about in 1870, and it's just as the 15th Amendment has been passed. You talk about Robert and Betsy Harris.
Yes.
and their family, really. Can you tell us a little bit about them and why the
Sure. Well, I really wanted to make this kind of a story about African Americans as well. Of course, this is a bank for them, but I wanted to balance this broad story about the bank and its tragic history, putting in those personal experiences of African American depositors. And so I start. I'm putting my book here. I start the beginning of chapter 5, and I talk about the Harris family. And I talk about them bringing their daughter and son. Their daughter is named Mary Susan, and their son is named Charles, to the Richmond branch. And it's fascinating because, again, it's kind of on the heels of the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And they all open accounts. The mother and father have accounts, but they open accounts for Mary, Susan, and Charles. And she kind of, it's interesting to read her depositor record because there's the name, parents, if the person was enslaved during the period of slavery, who their masters were, what their occupations were. And it's so fascinating for her. It says her occupation was like going to school, which I think is really, really important. And possibly she was the only one in her family who could read. And so they were depositing not a lot of money, but just the mere fact of this family kind of all opening Freedman's bank accounts, I think was just an important perspective to take. We are not just talking about adults. We're not just talking about Black men. We're talking about Black women and children as well, kind of being initiated into this practice of banking during the period of Reconstruction.
something families still do to this day, which is interesting. And you mentioned this family doing this, and I think somewhere in the book I just jotted down as a note that in total over that 9 year, the bank had over 100,000 accounts.
Yes.
And over $75 million in their dollars in deposits, which is a lot today. Beyond that, over that 9 year span, so people were buying into this. They were putting their money where the bank's mouth was, I guess, and really wanting this to work. And I think that's what makes it so completely tragic, as we'll hear about in a few minutes. So as we kind of move through, there's folks like Robert and Betsy Harris, but there's also people like Robert Smalls, who some of the folks on our call are probably familiar with. But talk about him and his role in this, and because it's not that he's more famous today than certainly the Harris family. But talk about him a little bit too.
Well, Robert Smalls, of course, kind of gained fame and gained some money too by essentially stealing a Confederate ship in Charleston Harbor and kind of navigating it to the Union. And so he is an important Black political figure in this period, and he opens an account in the Beaufort branch. And so the fact that, again, he takes this step into his financial future, especially around the time that he purchases the home of his enslaver, which again is an amazing, or was an amazing feat. And he is one of the African Americans who is a staunch kind of advocate for the bank at the local level. He serves on an advisory committee to kind of spread the good news of the bank's good works among African Americans. And he is someone who is advocating for depositors until the very end. And so when we talk about him being one of 100,000 depositors that had accounts, I also put in the book too that on the same day that he opens his account, a group of white planters also open an account. And so by 1874, about 10% of depositors were white, and that's because the bank is seen as being the most stable, if not one of the most stable financial institutions in the country because of its kind of benevolent foundations and because of its supposed protection by the federal government.
And everybody would learn a hard lesson very soon. Someone actually has a question. I think it would fit in here nicely. Let me see if I can. It just flipped. Give me 1 second. Were African Americans allowed to deposit money in banks that served a white population? And what did this bank offer the depositors that was unique and different?
No, it's a great question. It depends on the city. In places like New York, African Americans could deposit in certain savings banks in cities like Philadelphia and DC. Yes, throughout the Southwest, so which is why this bank was so important to African Americans. And what was that second question?
It was sort of what made the bank unique and different from other banks. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
kind of covered
in terms of mission, because the bank was established for African Americans, and one of the other aspects of the bank that depositors believed made it special was because all of this literature marketing material was coming out of the bank, saying that the bank essentially had the full faith and credit of the federal government, which it didn't. Yeah. And so that a language of protection was ultimately what one of the things that doomed the bank in terms of why it failed.
Yeah, and obviously no bank really would have that protection until the FDIC came along in the Great Depression. So, and that's only to a certain amount. But so I think, as we're kind of more than halfway now through the story, but we begin to pivot a little bit. And as you mentioned, the loans are coming out pretty fast and furious. A lot of them are going to trustees. A lot of them are going to friends of trustees. Some are backed, some are not by collateral, as you were mentioning. And then there's this one piece that kind of, I think, is one of the catalysts of that really was a harbinger of the end. I think it's the Seneca Sandstone Company.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that connection, because again, that's another one of those connections. And then if you can kind of roll into what happened to the Jay Cook and Company and Northern Pacific Railroad as well in that same period, roughly kind of tie those two together and bring us to sort of the critical point of the bank.
Well, the Seneca Sandstone Company was a company that was essentially owned by Henry Cook. And it was wasn't a mill, it was a quarry outside of DC. And increasingly, Cook and his business partners were using Seneca Sandstone Company stock to get loans, which was not legal. But increasingly, Jay and Henry Cook were kind of going to another venture, and that was selling bonds for the Northern Pacific Railroad. They had been very successful during the war selling Union bonds, and they applied the same strategy to their financial relationship with the Northern Pacific Railroad. But at this time, they had a harder time raising capital. They were traveling around the country, traveling in Western Europe, and investors were not interested in buying. And so they were essentially over leveraged. Henry Cook ends up taking about $500,000 in loans from the bank. Interestingly, this comes out after the bank collapses. He is subsequently asked or forced to leave the bank's board in 1872. And at this time, Jay Cook and Company, again, is for leverage. They can't sell these railroad bonds, and they are really having a tough time financially, such that in September of 1873, Jay Cook and Company fails. And this is kind of a massive watershed moment for the American economy. The failure of this one bank was the kind of first domino to drop in the failure of many other banks in the countries, especially in New York and Philadelphia. And the Freedman's Bank is kind of in a precarious position. In addition to people who borrowed money not paying back their loans, depositors knowing that the American economy is being launched into a depression starts to make bank runs. And so the failure of Jay Cook and Companies begins the Panic of 1873. And this is kind of a major depression in the American economy during Reconstruction.
And the other thing that was interesting about the Seneca Sandstone Company was that some of the sandstone was used to build some of the early buildings of Howard University.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Oliver O. Howard he was a Civil War general, obviously Union general, but he was also a trustee of the bank, correct?
He was a trustee. He borrowed money. He was in business with D.L. Eaton, who founded a brick company, and much of that brick was used to build both Howard and the Smithsonian. Interestingly enough, John Alvord was an investor in both companies. And so we are talking about the enmeshing of businesses at this time. In an interesting way, the Freedmen's Bank is kind of at the center of this.
Yeah, and now we all know why regulations have come into favor over the years, because these things tend to happen. Greed tends to take over, unfortunately. But as you said, this is really the beginning of the end. These outstanding loans are out there. It really is becoming unstable and untenable. And they bring in someone named Charles Meggs to do really the first. You mentioned this earlier. Really, the first deep dive into the books, and he figures out that they had the bank had about 3,100,000 or so in total assets, and 3,300,000 in liabilities. And that's really the first time that it sees the light of day. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then also, at this point, we begin to see another name appear, Frederick Douglass, and you kind of tell how he got engaged in this story, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, Charles Meigs was entrusted to conduct the first examination of the bank in February of 1873. And the comptroller kind of tells him to investigate the banks in and around DC, and the Freedmen's Bank is the first one that he does. And so he looks at the bank's books. He sees that there are far more loans outstanding than the bank actually has in terms of money or cash. And so he issues a report. He says that essentially the bank's trustees and cashiers and administrators need to kind of right the ship. But he also says at the end of his report that he basically has faith that they can do it. That, of course, does not happen because there are no penalties for noncompliance. And so in 1873, of course, with the panic, the nation launches into a depression. There is another examination the following year. This one is more robust. There are a group of examiners who go out and examine the books of independent branches, of individual branches, and the same message comes out. And I have a bit about a specific examination in the St. Louis branch, and an examiner says that that this branch's books are kind of in good shape. The cashier, who's Black, is doing a pretty good job, but the depositors understand that that the bank is a dragnet. That's the term that's used. They know that most of their money is being sent to DC. They know that that money is being lended out to whites in DC, and the examiner even says that capital should be kept here, because this branch could do a lot in helping the depositors who live in the city. And so there is kind of all of this formation going on. And once the second examination is released, a handful of Black trustees at this time choose to advocate for Alvord stepping down. And so he does. at the beginning of 1873. And the trustees, some of whom I think hope that the bank can be redeemed. Others, I think the majority of the bank's trustees understand that the bank is on the verge of collapse anyway. But they encourage Frederick Douglass to be the bank's next president, soon to be last president. And so he takes the role in March and April of 1873, and that is kind of the beginning of the end for the bank, or the end.
Yeah, exactly. And he, I think, one quote that came out, it was March of 1874 that he was.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, 1874.
That's fine. And he wrote that after taking the job and looking a little bit, and he wasn't a banker either, and he had run obviously some newspapers and a few other things, but it really wasn't in his world professionally. But he said that Douglas wrote about inconsistencies in the data he was given prior to the job. I think we've all applied for a job or two over the years where data was inconsistent with the reality, but this is a real doozy for him. And unfortunately, he's really there at the end, and all he can do is sort of ride it down. And it does damage to his personal and professional reputation, which he writes about. But by June, almost actually close to July of 1874, the bank suspends operations. Although, I mean, this is where the greed just never ends. There's another trustee named George Stickney, and he continues to make loans even after the bank shutters, which is just stunning. And so this leaves a lot of people in a lurch. What did the depositors think? What happened to them and their money? That they put so much faith into this bank. Suddenly it's gone.
Yeah. Well, they kind of struggle with the commissioners who are appointed by Congress to kind of liquidate the bank's assets to try to get their money. And there's subsequently 5 payouts, but we're talking about just a percentage. It was at the most 20%, at the least 5%. And so by the 1890s, African Americans who still had accounts had gotten about 60% of their deposits, but that still leaves 40% who didn't. And those 40% continued to appeal to attorneys generals, to senators, to U.S. presidents into the 1930s and 1940s, asking for the contents of their depositors' accounts. And so we are talking about a failure of a bank that was so important to the recently emancipated. And its failure, especially so abruptly, was, I think, so startling to them, especially in terms of giving their trust and their savings to these white bank administrators who were using these deposits to fund their own risky investments.
And I think you share the number of 61,144 depositors lost about $3 million in the bank's collapse, and most of them never got a dime back. So a few questions that people had, and this one's logical, thinking again back to the economic crisis we had in 2008. Who went to jail over this?
It's a great question. Nobody went to jail. There were 2 major congressional inquiries, and nothing came of it. The only thing that happened was that the testimonies of those involved were put on record, but nobody was held to account for the bank's failure.
Nobody, Alfred, no one. It's stunning to think, but again, it's sort of cronyism and that type of crony capitalism in this sense that was at play. And of course, the only victims in this were those depositors. I mean, the main victims were the depositors.
Yeah,
I think Frederick Douglass was a victim in many ways as well. Certainly from a reputational perspective, but certainly these poor people, you think of coming out of just getting their lives, really. I mean, after slavery, and then suddenly this is just torn out. Another question that we have, someone said, do you think this was intentional? Was this a way to stop generational wealth for people of color? No money, no land, no schooling, all of that. Was this intentional by them, or were they just being really, really greedy?
I, on the one hand, I don't think it was intentional. I don't think that men like Henry Cook were thinking about this as them taking the money of African Americans. On the other hand, they did understand whose money they were borrowing, and I just don't think that they cared. And so intentionality is kind of hard to read here. I think they were playing a game, a confidence game, and they came out the winners because they had power, they had influence, they had capital. I don't actually think that men such as Henry Cook thought about African Americans all that much, which I think perhaps is worse because he didn't understand whose money he was investing or attempting to invest or plunder.
Yeah, and another question was, were those in charge still able to keep their money, their homes, their status? And basically, yes.
Yeah,
Unless their business went down in some other ways, which happened obviously in that panic, but not because of this.
Not because of the failure, no.
Not because of the any part of the bank around today. Another question: any remnants, any existence of it?
Not really. I mean, there are plaques to commemorate certain locations, but as far as I know, no.
No, other than the name, which is interesting. Back, I think in 2016 or 17, that the Treasury or one of the Treasury buildings was named the Freedman's Bank.
2015.
Right? 2015. Okay, so that was sort of something that happened. But we were talking before this as well, and so this something that began with the best of intentions in many ways. And started off fairly well, a little rickety, but fairly well. And certainly the people that it was intended for used it for the intended purpose. They bought into it. 100,000 investors, and that's several 100,000 people, probably, if not more. But it all comes crashing down. What does that do to the mindset of those folks after, and the legacy of that, particularly with financial institutions and bank and trust in general?
Sure. Well, I contend, especially at the end of the book, that we continue to have conversations in our political discourse about wealth inequality, economic inequality, and in particular, the racial wealth gap. And this comes from a specific place. This has a history. And as much as we talk about financial inclusion today, and the Treasury at the end of October just released a report about the importance of financial inclusion, really for democratic engagement. And so we talk about this quite a bit again in our political discourse. And I think a lot of Americans probably think that the federal government's first attempt at this started in the middle of the 20th century with the Fair Housing Act or the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, for example. But I think if we go back a century earlier, we can see the federal government's actual first effort to kind of think about and embrace financial inclusion with the Freedmen's Bank, and it failed because of lack of political will and lack of regulation. And so I think that these are kind of remnants of a history. This is a history of financial inclusion that I think needs to be examined in terms of hoping that something like this does not happen again, especially to disenfranchise the most vulnerable members of our population.
Yeah, and I think it also we also briefly chatted about a study that, and you've had some numbers too. This happened to come across the newswire yesterday, and it's from Axios, an online place. But it's a report that from the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which, of course, if it existed back then, would have saved most of the money for these poor people, but it didn't exist. And it talks about the share of U.S. households without access to a bank account. Either they have one or don't use it. And in the white population, it's about 1.9%. This is in 2023. And the black population is 10.6%. So that difference, and I think in your book, you say that this in particular, but actions like this have led to that distrust.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, consumer advocates call this the unbanked and underbanked, right?
Correct. That's what they use here. Yep. Yep.
Exactly. And so there is this kind of generational distrust in Black communities for white-owned financial institutions. And the way that our financial infrastructure is kind of set up to have access to credit, to get a home loan, to tap into home equity, you have to have a sustained relationship with the financial institution. And if African Americans are disproportionately choosing not to, I think we need to think about this history. Why don't African Americans trust traditional financial institutions? And so I think that, again, this has a history, this has a genesis, and I think the genesis is during the period of Reconstruction with the Freedmen's Bank. I mean, I often talk about the fact that I have members of my own family who will put money in certain places in their homes instead of in a traditional bank for a particular reason. This is the reason, to have safe, accessible, reliable access to your cash. Because there is this history of African Americans not being able to trust traditional banks.
Yeah, that's just, I remember my this is different, but my grandmother, who went through the Depression, did the same thing. She hid her money because the family lost everything, and it never believed anything. We have time for a couple more questions. I don't want to take too much of your time, but one was an interesting question here. Are there any major Black-run financial institutions today that you're aware of?
Yes, there are, I think, a handful of Black banks, mostly peppered in the South. And these banks are community banks by and large, and they serve the communities in which they operate. And so one of the kind of problems with the Freedmen's Bank, of course, is that the branches did not lend in the communities in which they were operating. They did not lend to the very customers who were depositing money. And so Black banks in particular really comport with the Community Reinvestment Act, which is its fundamental mission in terms of being a part of a policy solution to extend access to credit. And so Black banks, first and foremost, do this to provide financial services within the communities in which they reside and operate.
So the story of this bank is fascinating. Obviously, it starts off in a positive light, ends tragically, which is a common theme, unfortunately, with Reconstruction, and really a long part of American history, and as well. But the book, again, Savings and Trust, is a beautifully written too, and a nice read. It's not too long. And it's a very good read. Definitely worth purchasing. You can get it again through our store or other places, of course. And if you want to learn more about Justene, I think you have your own website, if I believe
Yes.
that, so you can learn a little bit more about her and find some of her other work as well. Justene, thank you so much for your time and for writing this book.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Great. I've enjoyed it as well. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks for the great questions. And we'll see you down the road. And everybody have a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you again. Bye-bye.